The room felt like a coronation, and my sister was the one wearing the crown, on stage. My father handed her an $80 million company, a $15 million mansion, and the keys to a new Tesla. I stayed invisible until a stranger in a gray suit slipped a thick envelope into my hand and walked away like he'd never existed. My name is Sienna Howard, and at 29 years old, I had officially become a ghost in my own life. If you looked at the family portrait hanging in the foyer of my parents' estate, you would see 4 people. But tonight, inside this cavernous private museum hall in Brentwood, Tennessee, there were only 3 Howards that mattered. There was my father, Grant, standing center stage with the microphone gripped in his hand like a weapon. There was my mother, Marianne, whose smile was so practiced it looked like it had been surgically set into place. And then there was Brielle, my older sister, the woman of the hour, the golden child, the newly crowned queen of an empire she had never lifted a finger to build. I stood in the shadows near the catering entrance, clutching a clipboard against my chest as if it were a shield. My role for the evening was not daughter or sister. It was closer to an event coordinator, or perhaps a glorified usher, while Brielle wore a shimmering gown that probably cost more than my car. I was dressed in a sensible black pantsuit that allowed me to fade into the background. I had spent the last 2 hours checking seating charts and ensuring the VIP investors had their preferred scotch, invisible until someone needed something, at which point I became a servant. The room was filled with the heavy, expensive scent of lilies and old money. Local politicians, logistics partners, and the elite of Nashville society were all turned toward the stage, their faces illuminated by the spotlights that left the rest of us in the dark. My father cleared his throat, the sound booming through the high-tech sound system. He looked out at the crowd with that charismatic, predatory grin that had closed 1,000 deals. He raised a glass of champagne, and the room went silent. He began by saying that legacy was not just about what you leave behind, but who you leave it to. He spoke about Howell and Reed Logistics as if it were a living beast he had tamed, rather than a company built on the backs of warehouse workers and drivers. Then came the numbers. He announced that effective immediately, the entire $80 million valuation of the company would be placed under Brielle's executive control. The crowd gasped politely. But he was not done. He announced that the deed to the $15 million estate in Brentwood was being transferred to her name tonight, and just for good measure. He gestured to the side of the stage where a curtain dropped to reveal a brand new Tesla, wrapped in a red bow the size of a child. The applause was thunderous. Brielle feigned shock, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, looking every bit the humble heiress. She was perfect for the cameras. She was the face of the brand. I, on the other hand, was the one who knew how the inventory software actually worked. But that did not matter. To them, I was just Sienna the slow one, Sienna the dull one, Sienna, who preferred grease on her hands to diamonds on her neck. From across the room, my mother's eyes locked onto mine. The message was clear, transmitted without a single word spoken. Do not ruin this. Do not make a face. Do not let anyone see that you are hurting. I looked down at my clipboard, checking off a name that was already checked, just to have somewhere to look. Then came the moment that made my stomach turn over. My father, high on the adoration of the crowd, decided that lifting Brielle up required pushing someone else down. He leaned into the mic, chuckling as the applause died down. He said that he was glad Brielle had the business mind, because if he had left the company to Sienna, the trucks would probably end up delivering frozen seafood to a hardware store. The laughter rippled through the room. It was not malicious laughter from the guests. They just thought it was a funny dad joke. But from the head table, I saw Brielle laugh the loudest. She threw her head back, her diamonds catching the light, reveling in the confirmation of her superiority. It was a public execution of my character, disguised as banter. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning mix of shame and anger. I wanted to drop the clipboard. I wanted to walk out the side door and drive until my tank ran empty. But I stayed. I stood perfectly still, letting the humiliation wash over me. because that is what I had been trained to do. I was the backdrop. I was the contrast that made Brielle shine brighter. That was when the air beside me seemed to shift. I had been so focused on the stage that I had not noticed the man approaching. He did not move like the other guests. He was not drifting aimlessly with a drink in his hand, looking for someone to impress. He moved with a terrifying precision, cutting through the crowd like a shark through water. He wore a gray suit that was well-tailored but lacked the flashy designer labels the other men were sporting. There was no name tag on his lapel. He stopped directly in front of me, blocking my view of the stage. For a second, I thought he was going to ask me where the restroom was or demand a fresh drink, but he did not look at me like a servant. He looked at me like I was a puzzle he had just solved. Without a word of greeting, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. It was cream-colored, unassuming, but it looked dense. He took my hand, the one holding the clipboard, and pressed the envelope firmly against my palm. He leaned in close, invading my personal space just enough to be heard over the applause that was erupting again for my sister. His voice was low, gravelly, and devoid of any warmth. He told me that I did not need to prove anything to these people. He said that I only needed to read what was inside the envelope, and I needed to read it at the right time. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. Under the fabric of the napkin I had instinctively used to cover it. I could feel the raised ridges of a notary seal. It felt official. It felt dangerous. Harder still, I could feel the unmistakable rectangular shape of a small USB drive tucked inside the paper. I looked up to ask him who he was, but he was already turning away. He did not look back. He did not go to the bar. He walked straight toward the exit, slipping out of the heavy double doors just as my sister took the microphone to give her acceptance speech. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out Brielle's voice. I squeezed the envelope tight. The paper crinkled slightly under my grip. My father had just handed my sister an empire worth $80 million. But as I stood there in the dark, clutching this strange package from a man who looked like he knew all our secrets, I had the strangest feeling that I was the one who had just been given the weapon. Growing up in the Howard household was like living inside a high-end furniture catalog. The rooms were vast, immaculate, and utterly devoid of life. We had white carpets that looked like fresh snow, and the standing rule was that you did not walk on them with shoes, or socks that were not white, or feet that looked like they had ever touched the ground outside. It was a house designed to be looked at, not lived in, much like the family that inhabited it. If you asked me to describe the sound of my childhood, I would not tell you about laughter or music. I would tell you about the silence. It was a heavy, pressurized silence that filled the hallways, only broken during our mandatory family dinners. These meals were not opportunities to connect. They were board meetings masquerading as nourishment. We sat at a mahogany table long enough to land a small plane on, with my father at the head and my mother at the foot, drifting miles away in her own perfection. The unspoken bylaw of these dinners was simple. Brielle speaks, and the rest of us listen. Brielle was not just raised, she was curated. From the moment she could walk, she was being groomed for the moment I had just witnessed on that stage. She went to the most expensive prep schools in Nashville, the kind where the tuition costs more than most people earn in a year. She had tutors for French, coaches for tennis, and consultants for her social image before she even hit puberty. She was the project, she was the investment. I, on the other hand, was the write-off. I was different, and in the Howard family. Different was a polite word for defective. I did not care about social hierarchies or the right way to hold a champagne flute. I liked structure. I liked logic. I liked taking things apart to see how the gears meshed together, while Brielle was learning how to charm donors at galas. I was in the garage, dismantling the lawnmower engine just to see if I could put it back together blindfolded. My parents called it tedious. They called me boring. I remember one specific Tuesday when I was 16 years old. It was raining, the kind of gray Tennessee rain that soaks into your bones. I had just come back from the state regionals for a robotics and engineering competition. I had spent 6 months building a hydraulic arm capable of performing delicate tasks, soldering the circuits until my fingers were burned and blistered. I had won first place. It was the first time in my life I felt like I was actually good at something, that I had a value that could be measured and proven. I brought the trophy to the dinner table. It was a heavy, gold-plated thing, tacky but undeniable. I set it down next to the crystal water pitcher. My father looked at it. He chewed his steak, swallowed, and took a sip of wine. He asked what it was. I told him I won. I told him I beat teams from 20 other schools. I waited for the smile, for the nod, for the good job. Instead, he wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and said that it was fine, he supposed. Then he looked me dead in the eye and said that while tinkering with toys was a cute hobby, Brielle was out there building the future. He said leaders hire mechanics. They do not become them. That was it. My victory was dismissed as a servant's skill. My mother was softer, but her softness was like a silk scarf wrapped around a knife. She looked at my hands, which still had a faint trace of grease under the nails despite how hard I had scrubbed them, and she sighed. She told me to put the trophy away because it was scratching the table. Then she turned to Brielle and asked about her debate club speech, beaming as if Brielle had just invented the English language. Her only comment to me for the rest of the night was a whispered reminder to stop slouching because I was making the family look low class. That was when I started to go quiet. It was a survival mechanism. If I did not speak, they could not criticize what I said. If I did not show them what I loved, they could not sneer at it. But the more I retreated into myself, the more they became convinced that there was simply nothing inside me. They mistook my silence for emptiness. They thought I was slow, uninspired, a blank slate that had failed to take the imprint of their greatness. By the time I was 18, I knew I had to pay my own way if I wanted any control over my life. I got a job at a local auto parts store, and later, night shifts at a logistics warehouse. Ironically, a competitor to my father's company. I wanted to understand the supply chain from the concrete floor up, not from a glass office looking down. When my parents found out I was stacking pallets and cataloging brake pads for $12 an hour, they were horrified. They did not see it as grit or independence. They saw it as a public embarrassment. My father asked me if I was trying to humiliate him. He asked if the allowance he gave me was insufficient, treating my desire to work as a symptom of greed rather than a need for dignity. To them, manual labor was proof of failure. It was what happened when you were not smart enough to pay someone else to do it. Brielle, of course, thrived on this. She was beautiful, sharp, and terrifyingly socially intelligent. She learned early on that she could use me as a prop to elevate herself. At family gatherings, she would drape an arm around me and make jokes about my little jobs or my grease monkey hobbies. She would say it with a laugh, blinking her long lashes, making it seem like sisterly teasing. Everyone would laugh with her. It was safe to laugh at Sienna. Sienna was the background character. Sienna was the punchline that did not fight back. She knew exactly where to press to make me feel small. She used her eyes to signal to everyone in the room that I was an object of pity. Poor Sienna. She would imply without saying a word. She just does not have the spark, does not she? I spent years drowning in that dynamic, suffocating under the weight of their expectations and their disappointments. I spent my 20s trying to be invisible, hiding in the back of rooms, wearing neutral colors, checking lists, and holding clipboards. But tonight, feeling the sharp corners of that USB drive through the paper of the envelope, I realized something had changed. The little girl who just wanted her dad to look at her robotics trophy was gone. The teenager who scrubbed grease off her hands so her mother would not wince was gone. I stood there in the dark, remembering the years of being the spare, the one kept around just to make the heir look better by comparison. I realized I did not want their approval anymore. I did not want a seat at their table. I did not want to be a Howard in the way they defined it. I just wanted to burn the whole artificial script they had written for me. The stranger was right. I did not need to prove anything to them. I had already survived their neglect. I had built a spine out of the very silence they forced upon me. And as I looked at Brielle on that stage, glowing in her unearned glory, I made a promise to the ghost of the girl I used to be. I was done being the shadow. It was time to turn on the lights. The life I built for myself after leaving the suffocating orbit of my parents' estate was not glamorous, but it was mine. I lived in a third-floor walk-up in East Nashville, a neighborhood that smelled of roasted coffee during the day and stale beer at night. The rent was steep for the square footage, but every cent came from my own paycheck. There was no marble in my kitchen, only laminate that peeled slightly at the corners, and I slept better there than I ever had in my canopy bed in Brentwood. My days were spent at a firm called Rivergate Compliance Studio. To the outside world, my job sounded excruciatingly dull. I was a risk management consultant, specifically focused on supply chain audits. While my sister was learning how to pose for society pages, I was learning how to read the fine print that everyone else skipped. I spent my hours staring at spreadsheets, bills of lading, and compliance logs, hunting for the discrepancies that signaled disaster. I discovered early on that I had a talent for the things most people hated. I could look at a stack of fuel receipts and tell you if a driver was stealing gas. I could look at a maintenance log and predict which truck was going to blow a transmission in 3,000 miles. My boss, a woman named Karen who smoked slim cigarettes and had eyes like a hawk, told me that I had a forensic mind. She said I saw the skeleton beneath the skin of a company. It was about 6 months ago that the two worlds, my real life and my family's facade, started to collide in my head. Rivergate had taken on a project auditing a mid-sized logistics firm out of Memphis. They handled cold storage transport, moving pharmaceuticals and perishable seafood across state lines. It was the exact same business model as Howell and Reed, my father's company. As I dug into the Memphis files, I started to see patterns that made my skin crawl. On the surface, the company looked profitable. They had shiny trucks and a charismatic CEO. But deep in the operational data, the rot was spreading. They were cutting corners on refrigeration maintenance to save 2% on overhead. They were fudging driver hours to meet impossible delivery windows. They were leveraging their assets, the trucks, the warehouses, to secure loans to pay off other loans. It was a house of cards, held together by creative accounting and pure luck. That was when I started looking at my father's empire with fresh eyes. Grant Howard walked around telling everyone that Howell and Reed was worth $80 million. He boasted about the valuation at every dinner party, using it as a bludgeon to silence anyone who questioned him. But I knew the industry margins. I knew that fuel costs were up 12% this year, and that insurance premiums for fleets had skyrocketed, unless my father had discovered a way to turn diesel into gold. The math simply did not add up. I saw the signs of a company that was beautiful on paper but hollow in the middle. I tried to talk to him about it once. I went over for a Sunday brunch about 2 months before the birthday party. We were standing on the patio, and he was bragging about a new fleet of trailers he had just ordered. I asked him, quietly and respectfully, about the debt-to-equity ratio he was carrying to finance them. I asked if the bank had adjusted the covenants given the market volatility. He looked at me as if I had asked him to explain quantum physics to a toddler. He laughed, a short, dismissive bark of a sound. He told me that I was adorable for trying to speak the language, but that this was grown-up business. He said I should stick to checking boxes at my little desk job and leave the high finance to the visionaries. He did not know that checking boxes was exactly how people like him got caught. While I was analyzing risk, Brielle was playing the part of the heiress, CEO on social media. Her Instagram was a curated feed of hustle culture aesthetics. She posted photos of herself in boardrooms she had never booked, holding pens she never wrote with, captioned with inspirational quotes about leadership and grinding while others slept. She showed off the backstage passes, the private dinners, and the test drives of luxury cars. To the world, she looked like the future. To me, she looked like a liability. She did not know the difference between revenue and profit. She thought logistics was just telling a truck driver where to go. She had no idea that if a reefer unit failed on a shipment of insulin, it was not just a bad day, It was $1 million lawsuit and a federal investigation. She was treating the CEO title as an accessory, like a new handbag that matched her shoes. Then came the summons for the birthday party. My mother called me a week prior, her voice tight and clipped. She did not ask if I was free. She told me I was needed. They needed someone to manage the guest list at the door. They needed someone to ensure the seating chart was adhered to because the caterers were incompetent. It was a test. They wanted to see if I would still heal. They wanted to see if Sienna, the disappointment, would come back and stand in the shadows to make Brielle shine brighter. I accepted. But I did not go because I wanted their approval. I had stopped craving that the day I moved my last box into my apartment in East Nashville. I went because I needed to see it for myself. I needed to walk into that room and look at the investors, look at the spending, look at the sheer scale of the waste. I wanted to see if the $80 million empire was real, or if my father was throwing a coronation on the deck of a sinking ship. When I arrived at the venue and saw the champagne tower, the imported flowers, and the sheer excess of it all, I felt a cold knot of validation in my stomach. A company with healthy cash flow does not spend this kind of money on a birthday party. A company trying to distract investors from a bad quarter does. So when I took that clipboard and stood by the entrance, I was not just a dutiful daughter. I was an auditor walking into a crime scene. I watched my father shake hands, his smile a little too wide, his sweat a little too visible under the stage lights. I watched my mother nervously scan the room, ensuring the illusion held. And then I watched Brielle, laughing and spinning in her dress, completely unaware that the ground beneath her high heels was likely made of paper mache. I stood there, invisible and silent, collecting the data points, waiting for the math to finally crash down on top of them. I just never expected that the crash would start with a stranger handing me an envelope and telling me I held the detonator. The party was a masterclass in performative wealth. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked like architectural models. While a string quartet played pop songs at a tempo slow enough to sound classical, I moved through the crowd with my clipboard, checking off names that I knew by heart, making myself as flat and unnoticeable as the wallpaper. But because I was invisible, people forgot to lower their voices around me. I was standing near a cluster of velvet armchairs, adjusting a floral arrangement that did not need adjusting, when I heard the low murmur of serious money. 3 men were huddled together, swirling amber liquid in heavy crystal glasses. I recognized 2 of them. They were senior partners at the private equity firm that had provided the mezzanine financing for my father's last warehouse expansion. One of them, a man with a complexion like cured leather, leaned in close to the others. He said that the restructuring of the loan was aggressive, even for Grant. The second man nodded, taking a sip of his drink. He replied that it was not just aggressive, it was dangerous. He asked if anyone had actually seen the updated covenants from the bank. My ears pricked up. In my line of work at Rivergate, the word covenant was usually followed by the word violation. It meant the bank had set strict rules on how much cash you had to keep on hand, and if you dipped below it, they could take everything. If they were talking about restructuring, it meant Howell and Reed Logistics was not just expanding, it was struggling to breathe. Then a third voice cut in, sharp and skeptical. He asked whose name was actually on the deed for the new mansion. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, saying that if the asset was leveraged against the operating capital, then this whole party was being thrown on a credit card that was about to be declined. Suddenly, the conversation died. The air around them seemed to freeze. I looked up and saw my father sweeping past them, a shark in a tuxedo. Clapping a hand on the shoulder of a senator, the investors straightened their ties and forced tight smiles, pivoting instantly from concern to congratulation. The mask was back on. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The $15 million mansion my sister was about to receive was not a gift. It was likely a liability. On stage, the lights shifted, bathing the room in a cool, futuristic blue. My father stepped up to the microphone again, beaming as the curtain rose to reveal the Tesla. He spread his arms wide. He announced that this car represented the future of Howell and Reed, He spoke about a green initiative, about eco-friendly fleets, and about a commitment to sustainable transport. I almost laughed out loud. Sustainable? Last month, while digging through industry forums for work, I had seen threads complaining about my father's company. There were allegations of temperature excursions, industry speak for letting the refrigerated trucks get too warm. There were rumors that drivers were being told to manually alter the digital logs to hide the spoilage. My father stood there preaching about saving the planet, while his company was likely pencil-whipping safety data just to keep the contracts. Then it was Brielle's turn. She glided to the microphone, the skirt of her gown rustling like money. She accepted a glass of champagne from a waiter and held it up to the light. The room hushed. She smiled, that perfect camera-ready smile that never quite reached her eyes. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked Daddy for his vision and Mommy for her support. Then her gaze drifted across the room, searching the shadows until it landed on me. She said that she was so grateful for her family. She said that running a company like this took a specific kind of strength, a specific kind of vision. She tilted her head, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. She said that everyone had a suitable role to play in this legacy. Right, Sienna? The spotlight swung toward me. For a second, I was blinded. I blinked, feeling 300 pairs of eyes assessing me, judging my plain suit, my clipboard, my lack of sparkle. The subtext was brutal and clear. Brielle was the queen, and I was the help. I looked toward my mother. Marianne was standing near the front, clapping elegantly. Her eyes were fixed on me, hard and unblinking. It was the look of a prison warden. It said, "Do not you dare make a scene." It said, "Smile and take it." I forced the muscles in my face to remain neutral. I did not smile. I did not frown. I just nodded. Once, acknowledging the hit. The spotlight swung back to Brielle, and the tension in my chest released slightly. I needed air. I backed away, retreating further into the dim perimeter of the room, near the heavy velvet drapes that covered the service entrance. That was when I saw him again. The man in the gray suit. I had clocked him earlier. But now I really looked at him. He was older, perhaps late 60s, with hair the color of steel wool and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He was standing alone, away from the bar, away from the sycophants. He was not drinking. He was not taking photos. He was watching my father on stage with a look of profound, cold calculation. It was not the look of a guest. It was the look of a hunter waiting for the wind to change. He must have felt my gaze, because he turned his head and looked directly at me. He did not smile. He simply walked toward me, moving with that same efficient purpose I had noticed before. He stopped 2 feet away, up close. He smelled of unscented soap and old paper. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope. This was the moment the timeline split. He placed it in my hand, covering my fingers with his own for a brief second. His skin was dry and cool. He leaned in, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise of the applause. He told me to listen carefully. He said that they were going to invite the press up to the stage in about 20 minutes. He said they were going to stage a signing ceremony for the handover of the assets. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. He tightened his grip on my hand slightly. He instructed me to wait for that exact moment. He said I must not open the envelope before then. He said if I opened it now, they would just escort me out. But if I opened it when the cameras were live, when the pens were in their hands, I would survive. He released me. He said that I had been invisible my whole life, but tonight, I had to choose to be seen. Then he turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving me standing in the dark with the weight of the envelope in my hand. It felt heavy, dense with papers and that hard lump of the USB drive. I looked at the seal. It was official. I looked at the stage, where Brielle was now posing for selfies with the Tesla. The investors were clapping. My parents were glowing. The whole room was a beautiful, expensive lie, and I was holding the truth. I realized then that this was not a prank. This was not a game. This was a surgical strike. And for some reason, the stranger had decided that I was the only one with the hands steady enough to hold the scalpel. My fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I checked my watch. 20 minutes. I could wait 20 minutes. I slipped the envelope under my clipboard, took a deep breath, and prepared to ruin the party. The applause from the ballroom was still thundering against the walls, but it sounded muffled and distant, like thunder rolling in from another county. I slipped through the heavy velvet service curtains and sprinted, down the narrow corridor that led to the staff quarters. I found a small changing room used by the catering team, threw myself inside, and locked the door. My back slid down the cool metal of the door frame until I hit the linoleum floor. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. It was the smell of work, a stark contrast to the lilies and expensive perfume I had just left behind. My hands were trembling so violently that I had to press them against my knees just to steady them. My throat felt like I had swallowed a handful of sand. I placed the envelope on my lap. The wax seal had already cracked in my grip. I took a deep breath, the kind you take before diving into deep water, and tore it open. 3 distinct sets of documents slid out, along with the small silver USB drive. I picked up the papers first. My auditor's brain kicked in, overriding the panic. I knew how to read these. I knew how to look for the clauses that mattered. The first document was a copy of a voting trust agreement, dated 12 years ago. It was standard legal boilerplate until I got to the signatory page. There were 2 signatures. One was my father's, bold and sprawling. The other belonged to a woman named Evelyn Rusk. The second document was a designation of successor trustee. I scanned the lines, my eyes darting back and forth, looking for the trap. And then, I stopped. I stopped breathing. I stopped blinking. There, typed in a plain, unadorned font, was my name, Sienna Marie Howard. It did not list me as a beneficiary. It did not list me as an owner. It listed me as the successor voting trustee for the employee stock ownership plan. My stomach dropped. I flipped to the third document, a set of board minutes from a decade ago. The language was dense, but the implication was a sledgehammer. The company was not a sole proprietorship owned by Grant Howard. It was 40% owned by an employee trust, a trust established by Evelyn Rusk, the co-founder I had never heard my father mention. And according to the designation of successor trustee in my lap, upon the incapacity or removal of the primary trustee, the voting rights of those shares, the controlling interest when combined with the minority shareholders, transferred to me. I was not just a spectator, I was the failsafe. I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the USB drive twice before I managed to jam it into the adapter dongle I kept on my keychain for work. I plugged it into my phone. A file folder popped up on the screen. Single video file. I hit play. The screen filled with the face of an elderly woman. She was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, looking directly into the camera lens with eyes that were sharp, intelligent, and incredibly sad. She wore a simple cardigan, no jewelry. "Hello, Sienna," the woman said. Her voice was raspy but steady. "If you are watching this, it means Grant has finally decided to cash out on his own ego. It means he has chosen the spotlight over the truth." I brought the phone closer to my face. This was Evelyn Rusk. "You do not know me," Evelyn continued. "But I know you. I was Grant's partner when we started this company in a rented garage in Memphis. I handled the logistics. He handled the sales. When I retired, I did not want to sell my shares to him. I wanted to give them to the people who actually built the company, the drivers, the warehouse loaders, the dispatchers. So I created the employee stock ownership plan." She paused, taking a sip of water. "Grant hated it. He wanted total control. But he needed my capital. So he signed the agreement. But I knew he would try to break it. I knew he would try to dilute the shares, or cook the books to make the employee stake worthless so he could buy it back for pennies." On the screen, Evelyn leaned forward. The intensity in her eyes made me flinch. "He has been inflating the valuation. Sienna, that $80 million figure he loves to throw around? It is a ghost. It is based on projected contracts that do not exist and assets that are leveraged to the hilt. That mansion he is living in? The one he is probably gifting to your sister tonight? Look at the deed. It was likely purchased with company funds as a corporate retreat or executive housing to dodge taxes and hide the expenditure. It is not his to give. It belongs to the company. It belongs to the employees. My head was spinning. This was not just bad business. This was fraud. This was a breach of fiduciary duty that could send people to prison. I needed a successor, Evelyn said, her voice softening. Someone outside of his pocket. I watched you. Sienna, I watched you when you were 19, working the summer shift at the distribution center. I saw you stay late to help the new guy learn the scanning system. I saw you checking the tire pressure on the trucks when you thought no one was looking. Just because you wanted them to be safe, you have the one thing your father and sister lack. You respect the work. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and fast. I wiped it away angrily. Brielle is a show pony, Evelyn said. Brutal, but honest. If she takes the company, the bank will eat her alive within 6 months, and the employees will lose their pensions. You are the only one who can stop it. The document you are holding gives you the voting power of the entire employee block. You can call a board meeting. You can block the asset transfer. You can fire him. The video ended with a black screen and a single line of white text. Do not let them win. I sat there in the silence of the changing room, the phone screen casting a blue glow on my face. The pieces clicked into place with a terrifying precision. My father was not giving Brielle a gift. He was giving her a grenade. He knew the company was failing. He knew the debt covenants were about to snap. By transferring the company and the mansion to Brielle, he was offloading the liability. If the bank called the loans, they would come after the new owner. They would come after Brielle. He was setting up his golden child to take the fall for his own greed, likely planning to retire to a non-extradition country or plead ignorance while she faced the federal investigators. I looked at the documents again. Successor voting trustee. Brielle had just walked onto a stage to accept a crown that was actually a target. She was the queen of a kingdom made of ash. But I held the water. I stood up. The trembling in my hands had stopped. My throat was no longer dry. A cold, hard resolve settled in my chest. Replacing the fear, I was not the spare anymore. I was not the disappointment. I was the one person in the building who held the legal authority to burn the entire charade to the ground. I tucked the papers back into the envelope. I pulled the USB drive out and secured it in my pocket. I checked my reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. I looked the same. Plain suit, messy hair. But my eyes looked different. They looked like Evelyn's. I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. I had a party to crash. The service elevator deposited me into the subterranean coolness of the parking garage. The air down here was different. It smelled of oil, rubber, and the damp, earthy scent of underground concrete. It was quiet, save for the distant hum of the ventilation fans and the muffled bass of the music thumping through the floorboards above my head. I found him standing exactly where I expected him to be. The man in the gray suit was leaning against a concrete pillar near the exit ramp, arms crossed, watching the elevator doors with that same predatory patience he had displayed upstairs. He did not look surprised to see me. I walked straight up to him, clutching the envelope so hard my knuckles were white. I stopped 3 feet away, just outside of arm's reach. He nodded at the envelope in my hand. He asked if I had read it. I told him I had. I asked him who he was. He straightened up, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his lapel. He introduced himself as Caleb Rusk. He said he was the executor of Evelyn Rusk's estate and the current administrator of the voting trust until a successor was named. He pointed a finger at me. He said that successor was me. My mind raced back to the video. Evelyn Rusk, the woman who had built the logistics empire my father claimed was his sole creation. Caleb was her family. I asked him why he waited until tonight. I asked him why he let me stand there and be humiliated for 2 hours before handing me the weapon to stop it. I asked if this was some kind of twisted theater for him too. Caleb shook his head. his expression grim. He told me that theater was my father's department, not his. He explained that he was legally bound by the terms of the trust. He said the envelope could only be delivered once a public declaration of asset transfer was made that violated the original partnership agreement. He said if he had given it to me yesterday, Grant would have buried it. He would have shredded the files, paid off a judge, or found a way to declare the trust invalid before I could even read the first page. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He said that by announcing the transfer of the company and the mansion on stage, in front of witnesses and press, Grant had locked himself into a trap. He could not deny the transfer now. He had made the violation public. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This was not just a legal maneuver. This was a bear trap. Caleb warned me that this was the easy part. He said that reading the paper was simple, but enforcing it would be war. He told me that Grant would not go quietly. He said my father would claim the documents were forged. He would tell the board that I was a disgruntled daughter who was jealous of her sister. He would paint me as greedy, unstable, and vindictive. I told him I did not care what they called me. I cared about the company. I cared about the fact that they were gutting it. Caleb nodded, a flicker of approval crossing his face. He said that was good, because I was going to need that anger. Then he dropped the next piece of the puzzle into place. He asked me if I knew about Article 19 of the company bylaws. I shook my head. I knew supply chain compliance, not corporate governance. He explained that the bylaws allowed any voting trustee, that was me, to call an emergency board meeting without the chairman's approval if there was an imminent threat to the company's financial solvency. I asked him where the threat was. The company was valued at $80 million, at least according to the speeches upstairs. Caleb laughed. A dry, humorless sound. He told me to look at the mansion. He told me to look at the Tesla. He said those were not personal gifts. He said Grant had purchased them using company funds, likely categorized as capital assets. He explained that the company's loan covenants with the bank strictly prohibited transferring major assets to related parties, family members, without full market value repayment. My eyes widened. I understood immediately. If Brielle accepted that mansion and that car for free, and the company was the legal owner, it was a default event. The bank could call in the loans. They could demand immediate repayment of every single dollar Howell and Reed owed. With the cash flow in the state I suspected it was in, that would mean immediate bankruptcy. The party upstairs was not a celebration. It was a trigger event for a financial meltdown. Caleb continued, his voice sharp and precise. He said that the reporters upstairs were not there to celebrate Brielle. They were there to create a narrative. He said Grant wanted the world to see Brielle as the owner before the ink was even dry. He wanted to use public opinion to bulldoze over the legal reality. If everyone thought Brielle was the CEO, it would be much harder for a court to unwind it later without destroying the company's reputation. I realized then that this was a battle for the story. Whoever held the microphone controlled the truth. My father had the stage, the lights, and the champagne. I had a piece of paper and a terrifying amount of responsibility. I took a deep breath. The panic that had seized me in the bathroom was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating mindset I used when I was auditing a failing supply chain. I stopped thinking like a daughter. I started thinking like a trustee. I looked Caleb in the eye. I asked him what I needed to do in the next 48 hours. He looked at me, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. He told me not to go back upstairs. He told me not to make a scene at the party. He said that if I screamed and shouted now, I would look like the crazy sister ruining the birthday. I would lose the optics war. He said I needed to let them have their night, let Brielle drink the champagne, let Grant give his speeches, let them think they had won. He told me to take the documents to a lawyer immediately. He gave me a card for a firm that specialized in corporate litigation. He said to file the emergency notice for a board meeting tomorrow morning. He said I should not fight them on the dance floor. He said I should fight them in the boardroom, where the law was the only thing that mattered. He stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the concrete pillar. He told me that he had done his part. The rest was up to me. He said that Evelyn believed in me. and he hoped she was right. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty garage. I stood there alone for a moment, listening to the muffled thumping of the bass from the party above. I gripped the envelope tight. I was not going back up there to watch them celebrate. I had work to do. I turned toward my car, my mind already drafting the email to the board of directors. The coronation was over. The audit was about to begin. I did not go home to my apartment in East Nashville. I did not go to a bar to calm my nerves. Instead, at 2 a.m, I was sitting in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building downtown, staring at a mahogany table that was probably worth more than my car. I had hired Keystone and Hartwell LLP. They were not the family lawyers my father used for his estate planning. They were corporate litigators, the kind of firm you hired when you wanted to tear a company apart or stitch one back together while it was still bleeding. Across from me sat a senior partner and 2 associates, reviewing the documents Caleb had given me. To my left was a representative from Northglass PR. Caleb had been right about the narrative war. I knew that the moment I made a move, my father would paint me as the jealous, unstable sister. I needed a shield, and Northglass was the best in the business at crisis management. The lead attorney, a woman with glasses thick enough to stop a bullet, looked up from the trust agreement. She told me the chain of custody was solid. She said they had already verified the notary seal against the state database and confirmed the signatures. She said that if Grant tried to claim these were forged, he would be walking into a perjury trap. We spent the next 6 hours building a fortress out of paper. We drafted affidavits. We prepared a forensic timeline of the document handover. We made 3 digital backups of the USB drive and stored them on encrypted servers in 3 different countries. By the time the sun started to rise over the Cumberland River, we were ready for the counterattack before my father had even realized the war had started. While the lawyers handled the defense, I went on the offensive. I knew the company bylaws better than anyone because I had spent the last 5 years auditing companies just like ours. I knew that a special meeting of the board could be called by a voting trustee if there was probable cause of financial mismanagement. I needed allies. I pulled up the contact list for the board of directors. Most of them were my father's golf buddies, rubber stamp yes men who would sign anything he put in front of them. But there were 3 names that stood out, 3 members who had been quietly sidelined over the last 2 years. There was Arthur, the former operations director who had been pushed out for asking too many questions about safety protocols. There was Sarah, a forensic accountant who had raised concerns about the debt restructuring. And there was Elias, an old friend of Evelyn Rusk, who had refused to sell his minority stake. I called them one by one. It was 6 a.m. on a Sunday, but they answered. I did not beg. I did not cry. I spoke to them like the auditor I was. I told them I had evidence that the company was about to default on its loan covenants. I told them about the mansion transfer. I told them about the ESOP voting rights. Arthur listened in silence and then simply asked what time the meeting was. Sarah asked for the raw data, which I promised to have on her desk within the hour. Elias let out a long, heavy sigh and said he had been waiting for a phone call like this for 10 years. With my coalition secured, I turned to the data. I logged into the public databases I used for my job at Rivergate. I pulled the Department of Transportation safety ratings for Howell and Reed. I pulled the Uniform Commercial Code filings to see who actually held the liens on the trucks. The picture that emerged was terrifying. My father had stood on that stage and claimed the company was worth $80 million. He had sold a story of growth and green energy, but the filings told a different story. The short-term debt had ballooned by 40% in the last 6 months alone. The green fleet of Teslas was leased, not owned, and the terms were predatory. The company had 3 open investigations for safety violations regarding temperature control on pharmaceutical shipments. The $80 million valuation was a fantasy. It was a number invented to secure more loans to pay off the old loans. It was a Ponzi scheme built on 18 wheels. I compiled everything into a digital dossier. This was not just a family dispute anymore. This was a rescue mission. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with notifications. I had set up alerts for Brielle's social media accounts. She was awake and already posting. There was a photo of her holding a mimosa, captioned with something about the heavy burden of leadership. There was a video of her touring the new mansion, spinning around in the foyer, talking about how she planned to redecorate the entire West Wing. Every post she made was another nail in the coffin. She was publicly documenting the very asset misappropriation I was about to use to remove our father. She was proving, in real time, that she had no idea the mansion was corporate property. She was bragging about spending money the company did not have. The PR consultant from North Glass watched the feed with me. He asked if I wanted to leak a statement to stop her. I shook my head. I told him to let her talk. I said we should let her enjoy the celebration for exactly 24 hours. I explained that if we stopped her now, she could claim ignorance, but if we let her spend the whole day acting like the owner, giving interviews, and signing autograph requests, she would be undeniably tied to the fraud. Her incompetence needed to be a matter of public record. At 10 o'clock in the morning, I sat down at the conference table to draft the formal notice. Notice of emergency meeting of the Board of Directors of Howell and Reed Logistics. Reason: immediate review of executive compensation and breach of fiduciary duty. Voting trustee: Sienna Howard. I stared at the blinking cursor. This was it. Once I sent this, there was no going back to family dinners. There was no going back to being the quiet sister in the corner. I was about to fire my father and humiliate my sister in front of the people they wanted to impress the most. I thought about the way my father had laughed when he said I would deliver frozen fish to a hardware store. I thought about the way Brielle had looked at me on stage, like I was a piece of furniture that clashed with the decor. I hit send. The email went out to every board member, the corporate counsel, and my father's executive assistant. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Nashville skyline. I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked tired. My suit was rumpled from sleeping in a chair. I had no makeup on, but for the first time in my life, I did not look like a shadow. I looked like a CEO. I touched the glass, right over the reflection of my own eyes. I whispered to myself that this time, I was not asking for a seat. I was changing the table. The silence that followed my email lasted exactly 14 minutes. That was how long it took for the notification to travel from the board members' inboxes to my father's phone. When the response came, it did not arrive in the form of a counter-motion or a legal brief. It arrived as a call from a number I had known my entire life. Vibrating violently against the mahogany table of the conference room, I put it on speaker. My lawyer, the senior partner at Keystone and Hartwell, nodded at me to answer, but signaled for me to say nothing incriminating. I tapped the green icon. My father's voice filled the room, distorted by a rage so pure it sounded like static. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was. He called me a traitor. He screamed that I was a thief, a liar, and a disgrace to the name Howard. He demanded to know where I had stolen the documents from. He told me that I was to return my company phone and my car keys immediately, and that if I ever stepped foot on his property again, he would have me arrested for trespassing. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling a strange sense of detachment. A week ago, this wall of noise would have reduced me to tears. I would have apologized. I would have begged for forgiveness just to make the yelling stop. But today, surrounded by legal counsel and armed with the truth, his anger just sounded like fear. It sounded like a man who realized the lock on the cage was broken and the animal he had been kicking was finally biting back. I waited for him to take a breath, and then I spoke. My voice was level, devoid of the emotion he wanted to provoke. I told him that the documents were verified. I told him the meeting was valid under Article 19. I told him I would see him tomorrow. Then I hung up. If my father was the hammer, my mother was the scalpel. Her call came 2 minutes later. She did not scream. She wept. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She left a voicemail that I played for the lawyers. Between calculated sobs, she asked me why I was trying to destroy the family. She asked if I realized that I was killing my sister's future. She spun the narrative instantly. turning my legal intervention into a moral failing. She said I was jealous. She said I was bitter because I was not the one in the spotlight. She asked how I could sleep at night knowing I was ruining the happiest moment of Brielle's life. It was classic Marianne. She did not care about the fraud. She did not care about the embezzlement. She cared that the picture frame was cracked. Then came Brielle. Her reaction was the most telling of all. She did not call. She texted, and for the first time in years, her texts were not condescending. They were frantic. Dad says the police are coming for you. He says you forged signatures. Sienna, tell me it is not true. If the bank sees this, what happens to the house? What happens to me? The shift was palpable. Brielle had gone from the arrogant queen to the terrified scapegoat in under an hour. She was smart enough to realize that if there was criminal liability attached to the company, and she was the newly appointed owner, she was the one standing in the blast radius. By noon, the family rumor mill was in full swing. My phone pinged with messages from aunts and cousins I had not spoken to in years. They had clearly been briefed by my parents. They told me I was being manipulated. They said I was greedy. One aunt told me she always knew I had a dark streak, ever since I refused to wear a dress to my sweet 16. They were closing ranks, protecting the shared delusion of the Howard legacy against the threat of reality. At 1 o'clock, the official legal threat arrived. It came via urgent courier to the Keystone offices. It was a cease and desist letter from my father's attorney, a man named Sterling from a firm called Sterling & Vance. The letter was aggressive. It accused me of corporate espionage, theft of proprietary data, and violation of a non-existent non-disclosure agreement. It threatened a lawsuit for defamation if I did not withdraw the notice for the board meeting immediately. My lawyer read it and laughed. He tossed it onto the table like a piece of junk mail. He said it was a scare tactic. He said they had no ground to stand on because, as a trustee, I had a legal right to the documents. He told me to ignore it. But then, the real twist happened. I was scrolling through my emails, filtering out the hate mail from my relatives, when a message popped up on my personal encrypted app. It was from a number I did not have saved, but I knew the sender immediately by the signature. It is Jerry, from the cold storage warehouse. You need to know this. Jerry was the floor manager at the main distribution hub. He was a good man, one of the few who had treated me with respect when I worked there during my summers. He had taught me how to drive a forklift when my father wasn't looking. The next message made my blood run cold. IT guys are here. They are scrubbing the server racks. They are deleting the temperature logs for the last 3 years. They are saying it is a routine system update, but they are wiping the backups too. I thought you should know. I froze. This was not just financial maneuvering anymore. This was destruction of evidence. If they wiped those logs, there would be no proof that they had been shipping thawed pharmaceuticals. There would be no proof of the negligence that endangered public safety. Without that data, my case for removing my father for cause became much harder. We would be fighting over money, not crime. I looked at the lawyers. They were busy drafting the agenda for the meeting, planning a slow, methodical takeover. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted to do this by the book, but we did not have time for the book. If I waited until the standard 48-hour notice period, the servers would be blank. My father was panic cleaning the crime scene. I had a choice. I could protect myself, stay here in the safety of the law firm, and let the lawyers handle the paperwork while the evidence vanished. Or I could escalate. I could force a confrontation that would stop the wipe, even if it meant blowing up the company's reputation irrevocably. I thought about the drivers who would lose their jobs if the company collapsed. I thought about the patients waiting for medicine that might be spoiled because my father wanted to save money on refrigeration. I looked at my lead attorney. I told him we were moving the meeting up. He looked at me over his glasses. He asked when. I checked the time. It was now 3 p.m. Brielle had a press event scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock at the headquarters. She was supposed to sign the ceremonial handover papers in front of the local news affiliates. I told him we were holding the board meeting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He argued that it was aggressive. He said it would look like a hostile takeover. I showed him Jerry's text. I told him that it was not a hostile takeover. It was a crime scene intervention. I told him to file an emergency injunction to freeze the company servers immediately, citing the whistleblower tip. I stood up. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. My family thought they could bully me into silence. They thought they could shame me into submission. But they forgot that while they were busy posing for pictures, I had been the one watching the machinery work. I knew where the kill switch was. I told the lawyer to send the updated notice. I wanted the board, the lawyers, and my father all in the same room at the exact moment Brielle was planning to smile for the cameras. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, my father was shouting at IT technicians to type faster. Somewhere out there, Brielle was picking out her outfit for tomorrow, oblivious to the fact that she was dressing for her own downfall. I was done playing the victim. Tomorrow, I was going to be the judge. The coffee in the conference room had turned into sludge hours ago, but none of us stopped to brew a fresh pot. The air was thick with the static electricity of a looming storm. We were deep into the forensic accounting phase, peeling back the layers of my father's financial architecture like we were dissecting a diseased organ. Around 3 a.m, the lead associate from Keystone and Hartwell, a young man named Davis who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, let out a low, sharp whistle. He spun his laptop around to face me. He pointed to a flowchart he had just constructed based on the lien search. He told me to look at the collateral structure for the mansion. He said that on paper. It looked like a clean transfer of deed to Brielle. But if you followed the money trail through the 3 different shell companies my father had set up in Delaware, the truth was much uglier. The $15 million estate in Brentwood was not free and clear. It was cross-collateralized against the company's primary line of credit. I stared at the screen, the blue light stinging my tired eyes. I asked him to explain it in plain English. Davis took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He said that basically, the house was an anchor. If the company defaulted on its loans, the bank took the house. But here was the kicker. If the ownership of the house changed hands without the bank's prior written consent, which we knew they did not have, it triggered an automatic default on the business loans. My father had rigged the game so that the moment Brielle signed that piece of paper accepting the gift, she would personally trigger the collapse of the company. But it got worse, because Brielle would be the legal owner of the asset at the moment of default, and because the transfer documents were structured as a sale for $1 rather than a gift. She would be liable for the outstanding mortgage balance. My parents were not giving her a home. They were saddling her with $15 million of debt she could never repay. While simultaneously blowing up the family business, I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. I had always known my parents favored Brielle. I had always assumed they thought she was the special one, the princess who deserved the world. But looking at these documents, I realized I had been wrong. They did not love her more. They just respected her less. To them, I was the tool they could not use because I was too sharp. But Brielle was soft. Brielle was malleable. And now, I realized, Brielle was disposable. They were setting her up as a human shield. When the bank came calling, when the investigators started asking about the missing inventory and the falsified temperature logs, Grant and Marianne would point to the new owner. They would claim they had retired. They would claim Brielle was in charge. They would let their golden child go to prison to save their own retirement accounts. It was not a coronation, it was a sacrifice. I walked to the window, my reflection ghosting against the dark city skyline. I felt a strange, jagged pity for my sister. She was sleeping in a silk sheet somewhere, dreaming of her big day, completely unaware that the people who were supposed to protect her were currently sharpening the knife. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Caleb. He had sent a scanned image of a handwritten letter. The handwriting was shaky but firm. Evelyn's. It was dated 3 years ago, marked, "To be opened only in the event of my death or the activation of the successor trustee." I read the letter. In it, Evelyn detailed 3 separate occasions where Grant had tried to bribe her to dissolve the employee stock ownership plan. She wrote that Grant viewed the employees not as partners, but as parasites at eating into his margins. She warned that his ultimate exit strategy was to strip the company of its hard assets, the real estate. the trucks, and leave the shell of the operating company to the workers, effectively handing them a bankrupt entity while he walked away with the cash. This was the final nail. It proved premeditation. It proved that the chaos we were seeing was not just bad management. It was a calculated looting of the company. I looked at the North Glass PR consultant, who was dozing in the corner. I had the video of Evelyn on the USB drive in my pocket. I had this letter. I could release them to the press right now. I could wake up the morning news anchors and give them the scoop of the century. Local tycoon loots company, frames daughter. It would be a nuclear strike. But my lawyer stopped me. He said if we went to the press before the board meeting, Grant would spin it. He would say I was a hysterical, vindictive sister trying to ruin the family reputation with deep fakes and forgeries. He would say I was unstable. The narrative would become a catfight between sisters. Distracting from the financial crimes, he was right. We had to do this the hard way. We had to let the trap snap shut. I made the hardest decision of my life. I decided to let Brielle walk onto that stage tomorrow morning. I would let her pick up the pen. I would let her smile for the cameras. I needed her to sign that transfer document. I needed the ink to be wet, because once she signed, the violation was a matter of legal fact, not just speculation. Once she signed, my father lost his plausible deniability. I turned to the legal team. I told them to prepare the rescue package. I wanted a motion to remove Grant Howard as chairman for cause. I wanted a motion to suspend Brielle's executive powers pending an external audit. I wanted a motion to appoint me as interim CEO to stabilize the creditors. And I wanted a motion to freeze all asset transfers immediately following the board vote. We spent the rest of the night drafting the resolutions. The language had to be precise. There was no room for error. We were planning a coup, but it had to look like a medical intervention. We were saving the patient by cutting out the tumor. By 6 a.m, the sun was bleeding orange across the sky. The city was waking up. I showered in the gym downstairs and changed into a fresh suit I had kept in my car. Navy blue, sharp, professional. I did not look like the girl in the catering uniform anymore. I looked like the person Evelyn Rusk believed I could be. We were packing up the files, ready to head to the headquarters for the showdown. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a cold, grim determination. I was ready. The evidence was bulletproof. The board members were aligned. Then, my phone chimed. It was a text message. Not from Jerry, not from Caleb. It was from an unknown number, spoofed to look like a local area code. I picked it up, expecting another hate message from a cousin. Instead, I read the words, and the blood drained from my face. Brielle is holding a different set of papers. Grant switched them 10 minutes ago. If you do not get there right now, you are walking into a firing squad. I stared at the screen. My heart slammed against my ribs. If Grant had switched the papers, then Brielle wasn't signing the deed to the mansion. She wasn't accepting the toxic asset. He must have realized I was coming. He must have realized the trap was too obvious. If she wasn't signing the liability, then what was she signing? And more importantly, if the papers were different, my entire legal argument for the emergency meeting, the breach of covenant, the default trigger, would evaporate the second I walked into the room. I would look like a fool. I would be accusing them of a crime they hadn't committed yet. While they waved a harmless piece of paper in front of the press, I grabbed my briefcase. I shouted at the lawyers to move. We didn't have time for the convoy. I needed to get to that stage before the pen touched the paper, or everything Evelyn had fought for was gone. The lobby of Howell and Reed Logistics had been transformed into a theater of corporate vanity. A raised platform had been erected in front of the reception desk, draped in the company colors of navy and silver. Dozens of chairs were arranged in neat rows, filled with the local press, the nervous junior executives, and the shareholders who still believed the $80 million fairy tale. Standing in the back, behind the velvet ropes, were the people who actually made the company run: the forklift drivers, the dispatchers, and the warehouse staff, looking uncomfortable in their work uniforms. My father stood at the podium, basking in the flash of the cameras. He looked invincible. Beside him, Brielle stood poised with a gold fountain pen in her hand, hovering over a leather-bound document. She looked like a princess in a fairy tale, completely unaware that the dragon was the man standing next to her. I did not use the side entrance this time. I walked through the double-glass front doors, flanked by the lead partner from Keystone and Hartwell and the 2 security guards I had hired privately. The sound of my heels clicking on the marble floor cut through the hushed anticipation of the room. Grant saw me first. His smile faltered, then hardened into a snarl. He stepped away from the microphone, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He bellowed for security. He shouted that there was a trespasser in the building and demanded I be removed. The company security guards hesitated. They looked at my father, then at the serious men in suits standing next to me, and they stayed put. I walked straight to the edge of the stage. I did not yell. I did not cry. I projected my voice with the cold, hard clarity of an auditor delivering a failing grade. I announced that this meeting was now an official emergency session of the Board of Directors, convened under Article 19 of the company bylaws. My mother, sitting in the front row, let out a theatrical gasp. She stood up, clutching her pearls, and cried out asking why I was doing this. She asked if I was trying to kill my sister's happiness out of pure jealousy. I ignored her. I climbed the steps to the stage. Grant moved to block me. His fists clenched. He hissed that I was making a mistake. He said I had no authority here. He said the papers I stole were forgeries and that if I said one word, he would sue me into oblivion. I turned to the audience, to the board members sitting in the second row, and to the cameras that were now swiveling to catch the drama. I held up the document Caleb had given me. I stated clearly that I was not there as a daughter. I was there as the successor voting trustee of the Employee Stock Ownership Plan. I explained that 40% of this company belonged to the people standing in the back of the room, and as of last night, the voting rights for those shares belonged to me. Grant laughed, a nervous, cracking sound. He told everyone to ignore me. He told Brielle to sign the papers. He said I was delusional. I looked at Brielle. Her hand was shaking. The pen was hovering inches from the paper. I told her to look at what she was signing. I told her that Dad had switched the papers 10 minutes ago because he knew I was coming. I told her that the document in front of her was not a deed. It was a personal guarantee for the company's debt. Brielle froze. She looked at our father. Grant's eyes darted around the room, sweat beading on his forehead. I continued, relentless. I revealed that the $80 million valuation was a lie. I explained that the mansion and the Tesla were not gifts, but corporate assets purchased with leveraged loans. I told the room that the bank had cross-collateralized the estate against the operating line of credit. If Brielle accepted ownership, she was not becoming an heiress. She was becoming the primary target for the foreclosure that was triggered the moment the title changed hands. The room went deadly silent. The reporters were typing furiously on their phones. Grant lunged for the microphone, shouting that I was a liar, that I was trying to sabotage the company because I was bitter. I nodded to my lawyer, who connected his laptop to the large presentation screen behind the podium. The face of Evelyn Rusk appeared, 10 feet tall, looking down on the proceedings like a judge from the afterlife. The video played. Evelyn's voice rang out, clear and damning. She spoke of the accounting tricks. She spoke of the way Grant viewed the employees as liabilities. She spoke of the specific plan to use a family member as a shield against the inevitable bankruptcy. She looked into the camera and said that Grant would smile while he handed someone a grenade, just so he could be out of the room when it exploded. The video ended. Brielle dropped the pen. It clattered loudly on the stage floor. She turned to look at our parents. For the first time in her life, the fog of adoration lifted. She saw Grant not as the benevolent king, but as a man who was willing to send her to federal prison to save his own skin. She saw Marianne not as a supportive mother, but as an accomplice who had watched her dress up for her own execution. Brielle stepped back, her face pale. She looked at me, and I saw something new in her eyes, respect and fear. I turned to the board members, Arthur, Sarah, and Elias, who were now standing. I called for a vote. The motion was to suspend Grant Howard as chairman and CEO immediately pending a forensic audit. The motion was to strip Brielle Howard of all executive signing authority. The motion was to appoint Sienna Howard as interim CEO to restructure the debt and stabilize the company liquidity. Arthur voted yes. Sarah voted yes. Elias voted yes. With my 40% voting block, it was a landslide. Security finally moved. But they did not come for me. They stepped onto the stage and gently but firmly escorted my father away from the podium. He was shouting about loyalty, about legacy, but no one was listening. My mother collapsed into her chair. Realizing that the audience she had performed for all her life had finally walked out. I walked over to Brielle. She was trembling. I did not hug her. This was not a moment for fake affection. I told her that she had a choice. I said she could leave right now, walk out the door, and I would ensure she received a fair, transparent severance package that would help her start over. But without the mansion and without the Tesla, or I said, she could stay. But if she stayed, she started at the bottom. I told her she could learn operations. She could learn how the business actually worked, not the fantasy version. Brielle looked at the exit, then at me. She nodded slowly. She whispered that she did not know how to do anything else. She asked if I would teach her. I told her we would see. Then I turned to the back of the room. The warehouse workers, the drivers, the people in the neon vests were watching in stunned silence. They had spent years being invisible, treated as interchangeable parts in Grant Howard's machine. I spoke into the microphone. My voice did not waver. I told them that the era of the show pony was over. I told them that from this moment on, the value of this company would be measured by the work done on the loading dock, not the speeches made in the lobby. I looked directly at the old forklift driver who had texted me the warning about the servers. I said that from today on, no one would ever be forced to sit at the end of the table just because they did not fit the picture. For a second, there was silence. And then, a single pair of hands started clapping, then another, then the whole back of the room erupted. It was not the polite, gloved applause of the country club set. It was the heavy rhythmic applause of people who finally felt the ground under their feet stop shaking. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the front doors. The girl who used to hide in the changing room was gone. I took a deep breath, adjusted my jacket, and got to work. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Sienna's revenge. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that notification bell to help this story reach even more people.